Hey, everybody, welcome to the Addiction Unlimited podcast, where you get to learn everything you want to know about addiction and recovery. I'm your host, Angela Pugh, co-founder of Kansas City Recovery, life coach, and recovering alcoholic. To learn more about me, you can listen to episode 0 on your podcast app or find us on the web at addictionunlimited.com. Hey, Ted, thanks so much for coming on and doing this show with me. I'm super excited to get into this conversation because what you did is so fascinating and I have so many questions. So I'm really excited to dig in. Why don't we take a second and just tell everybody a little bit about you and what you do?
Well, thanks, Angela, and thanks so much for having me. As I told you, I'm a big fan. I've had several different careers, and I started working in the Hollywood studio system at Warner Brothers and Universal. I had a background in television, private television in Europe for a while. And then I started working in independent film financing. I started doing productions and co-productions, film licensing. And then I got into screenwriting, which was a passion that I had sort of buried for a long time. And I decided, I've got to do this. I've always wanted to write a screenplay. So I wrote a screenplay and I sold my first screenplay, like out of the blue. And it got made into a movie. And then I sold more screenplays and I became sort of like a pretty successful working screenwriter. And then I got involved in university lecturing and travel and VOD and content distribution, et cetera. And then I got into a little bit of trouble with alcohol, and I decided to do something about it. And I decided to start attending AA meetings, and then I gravitated over to 12-step meetings. To Smart Recovery meetings. And then I decided, I like Smart Recovery, so I became a Smart Recovery facilitator. And then I started doing videos and marketing for Smart Recovery, the organization. And that just opened up this whole sort of world of people in recovery that I fell in love with. And now I'm just pleased to be part of this in my own little niche, which is writing this book to talk about my experience of recovery and how movies can help people in that process and that conversation.
Yeah, what an incredible career too. So tell me a little bit about your journey with your own drinking. Like, at what point did you understand that this was a bigger problem than just, oh, I need to cut back or, I have to put down the alcohol?
Right. Well, it's funny. Alcohol has been sort of my life story in many regards. Not that I started drinking when I was 5, but my father was a diplomat, and he and my mother, part of their job was, we lived in all these different countries, but part of his job was to give parties, cocktail parties, constantly. And so growing up, we were always having cocktail parties. I was always filling drinks and, delivering hors d'oeuvres and talking to people. And part of that was sort of like U.S. diplomacy is based a lot on cocktail parties and getting people a little bit loopy so that they, spill trade secrets and like, when are the Soviets going to invade Afghanistan, kind of a thing. And I actually wrote a script about that, which is a whole other story. But then moving into the film industry in my adult years, I realized that there was a lot of drinking in that too, and a lot of socializing. So I had to buy drinks for movie stars. I had to take clients out for dinners and drinks. Anytime I went to China or Korea or Hong Kong, the drinking culture, bonding culture, business bonding culture was very alcohol centric. And so, and it was all very manageable and it was all very great for a long time. First class travel, business class lounges, free drinks everywhere. It was all part of the allure of that. Like in many ways, that was the whole point of having a great job, in the movie business. And the Cannes Film Festival, every night, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning, you try to get into this hot party so you can have a drink with Harvey Weinstein or maybe not Harvey Weinstein, but big producers and try to cut deals. And all of this was done in the sort of ensemble experience of alcohol. But then as I got into screenwriting, I started producing and independent screenwriting. I started to see these lulls in activity. Whereas before I'd been like breakneck schedule, always meeting deadlines, no day drinking. It was all social drinking. Suddenly I found that I was drinking to pass the time or to procrastinate or waiting for notes to come through or waiting for a movie to go through or waiting for the payments to come. And so there's a lot of waiting around in the film business. Things happen very quickly and then suddenly It's the mantra here is, well, just hurry up and wait. And everybody in the film industry knows that. And people adapt, and a lot of people in my circumstances also turn to drugs and alcohol, and not just me. But I did, and I realized that was a problem, and so it was affecting my family life and my marriage and my health, and just I didn't want to be that guy anymore. So I just quit, and I stopped, and I put all my dream team together of like a therapist, my sister, my family, my friends, and being very public about my issues with people by writing this book, working with Smart Recovery, and being a Smart Recovery meeting facilitator. Now I have this great, fantastic group of people who also support me in my journey of recovery. And so, yeah, people ask me sometimes about my rock bottoms, and yeah, I was the guy that would go to 7-Eleven, every morning and buy a 12-pack. And that was not cool. That was not a way to live my life anymore. So I became very physically dependent on alcohol, and suffered great anxiety if I didn't have alcohol set up to drink during the day, or if I didn't have something planned. So I was realizing that I was rearranging my real life to accommodate my drinking schedule, which was absurd. And so I decided that's absurd. I'm missing out on life, and life is offering me so many wonderful things right now, with work and my family, my kids, everything, that I decided to change course.
That is such an important piece that you just said, to understanding or coming to the realization that you were rearranging your life to accommodate your drinking. I always talk about it in terms of like our level of commitment. And I was so committed to my drinking and my lifestyle that I was willing to sacrifice anything. I would sacrifice friends, relationships, my integrity. I mean, whatever
Yeah.
whatever it took, right? I was so committed to it. And it's such an important piece of it, though, because I feel like when you start to connect those dots and connect those pieces, you start to understand really how much bigger it is than just drinking. There's
Yes.
a much bigger picture happening.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I'm glad I stopped, and I love to be able to help other people stop whatever it is that they're doing, because of having gone through experience and understanding, that those feelings that you get when, more than anything, the frustration of like constantly cogitating and always thinking about drinking or using, it's just exhausting. And now to be freed to concentrate and think about other things is very liberating. That to me is like true freedom. Um,
Yeah. Now, how did you know to put a team of people together? Because you're one of the only people I've ever heard say that. Like, you decided you had to quit drinking and you started putting this team of people together. Not many people would have that foresight, So, how did that come to you? Or is that just how your brain works? Like, I'm a little bit like that, right? Like, I want to start something different or new that I don't really know about. And I'm like, okay, who can help me? Who can be my mentor? Who can I learn from? Who can guide me? How did that work for you to put your team together?
Well, thanks for that question. That's because, it really made me start to think and remember why I did this. But, my attempts to quit by myself, to keep this a secret, to not reveal that because it would reveal weakness, or maybe somebody wouldn't hire me, or that somebody would find out and I wouldn't get a gig, or it would destroy my life, or whatever. And so I realized that I was being very secretive and very personal about it, and thinking, oh, I can do this all by myself. And my previous attempts to do it, had run into problems. And I realized that I actually kind of needed to externalize the conversation outside of my mind, so that it was more an objective reality as opposed to a subjective mind fuck that I was going through in my own head. Is that okay to say that word? I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
So instead of just going through that mental process all the time, all by myself, I decided, well, I've got to reach out. And so, if I have some issues from my past, I'd like to talk to them with a psychologist. If I've got some anxiety or depression issues, which are maybe clinical, I should go see my psychiatrist. And I'm on some antidepressants medications that are very generic SSRIs, which have helped me immeasurably in my frame of mind, and are also used by a lot of people very successfully. And then, doing the mutual support thing, I thought was very, very important. And not just participating and being able to talk to other people about our shared experiences and our urges and everything, but to have like a mechanistic approach a roll up your sleeves, get the work done, use a workbook, fill it out, which is part of the smart recovery, experience. I thought that was a really great way of going about it as well. And then, by continuation, actually, the dream team was the icing on the cake is doing the book, because it's like now I'm documenting what I want, what I've wanted to say, what I've experienced, and what I think people might be interested to hear about how movies helped me. And part of that whole thing, that part of the dream team was, I'm going to start watching movies. So I watched 100 movies in 100 days, and gosh darn it, it really helped. It really worked.
Okay, I wanted to get into that 100 movies in 100 days because I have questions. But
Okay.
I want to ask one thing before we get into that part. Did you have the experience of losing things in your life? And I ask this because a lot of us didn't lose everything. I feel like there's this common story that really gets a lot more
Right.
publicity,
Right.
in the I burned my life to the ground, I went to prison for 17 years, all of this stuff. But for a lot of us, that wasn't our story at all. A lot of us were very high functioning,
Yes.
successful people with
I
money in
was.
the bank, and we were fine. So,
Yeah.
what was your experience there? Did you lose relationships, money, jobs, houses, any of that stuff?
Luckily, I didn't. I stopped before it got into those consequences, and luckily, I I could see far enough ahead that I knew where it was heading, and I knew that I had to make a change. And there was part of me that said, "Screw it! I'll just let all this stuff happen, and I'll deal with the consequences later. I don't want to make a decision right now." But I realized that that was going to get me into trouble, and I had everything to lose: money, house, all these things that you mentioned. But more than anything else, I think I was lucky that nothing bad happened. But more than anything, I feel bad that there were lost opportunities. That I think alcohol clouded my judgment when there were times when I could have done something that would have led to something really amazing, but it didn't because I was too busy drinking, or maybe the way that I thought about an opportunity or a person or a situation was clouded and muddled by the fact that I was in my addiction, and that maybe I made the wrong decisions and could have done things better. And so I'm not the kind of person who wants to live with regret. And I think regret is one of the most toxic feelings that you could have. And I just didn't want to be riddled with regret for the rest of my life. And so I decided that, and yes, I still have regrets, but everything that I do now going forward in sobriety is to eliminate and never create regrets for myself. And one of the regrets I would have had is to never write this book. So I vanquished that regret by writing a book. And now I've got other projects that I want to engage in, to know that I've been able to fulfill all of the potential that I have in this world to help people, and to do things that I find are useful and helpful. And you can't do that. Alcohol and drugs, it just inevitably, at least for me, will always lead to regrets. And that's a really bad currency in somebody's healthy mental life, I think.
Yeah, amen to that. Okay, let's get into this book, okay? For the audience, Mr. Perkins decided to watch 100 movies in 100 days. 100 movies about addiction or with addiction storylines. Am I saying that correctly?
About addiction and recovery, either showing addicted people, showing recovery, showing both.
Okay.
Something having to do with where addiction and recovery is like one of the central elements. That if you took it out, it wouldn't be a movie anymore.
Okay, perfect. Now, what I want to know first is, was this the plan from day one? Like, did you say, I'm going to do 100 movies in 100 days? Or did you say, like, I'm laying low, I'm going to start watching some movies,
It
and
was
then it just evolved into 100 movies in 100 days?
Yeah, it evolved. It was definitely the latter. As you know, when you get sober, and I was waiting around for TV deals to happen, and I had money in the bank, so I'm new to sobriety. I'm like, all right, well, I've got a lot of time to fill, and so what do I do? And so I had my iTunes account and my 85-inch TV, and I thought, all right, well, there's some really great movies out there. I'm going to just start watching movies. So I just started watching movies. I made a lot of popcorn. I drank a lot of Diet Coke, and I wanted to get through them. Before I knew it, there was over 100 movies, and I realized that I wasn't running out of movies. There are still more movies. And I would ask people and tell people, and they'd be like, have you seen this movie? And I'm like, oh my God, you mean that's not on my list? I got to go see that movie. So it became sort of like this thing that evolved after I decided to barricade myself in my room and watch movie after movie after movie. And I
I feel a little surprised that you found 100.
Oh, there's
That
more.
is
There's
beautiful.
more. There's more. There's like at least 300 or 400 movies. And if you go deep into the past, movies that probably are not even available on streaming platforms are so old. They're movies made in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, underground movies, independent films that are quite like you'd never know about them, but they're like they were made, and maybe nobody saw
Yeah.
them, but maybe they were in a drive-in movie somewhere, or perhaps they were so depressing that nobody really liked them, and so they got shelved. And I think most people don't know this, but of all the movies that have ever been made, something like 60% of them are in a vault somewhere and have never been seen. So, some of those movies are about addiction and recovery.
Well, that sounds like a big waste of money.
Well, listen, if there's one thing that the movie business does really well, it's waste a lot of money.
Yeah. Yeah, I could see that. With all the waiting, I was laughing when you were talking about hurry up and wait because I've a lot of actor friends, of course, and stuntmen. Some really great friends of mine are stuntmen, and that's what they always talk about is how much waiting. Like everybody thinks it's so glamorous, like to be on a movie set, but you're really standing around doing a lot of nothing
Yeah.
most of the time.
Well, that's actually the thing that I most hated about production was the waiting around. I mean, I would be an executive producer on a movie, and I'd go and I'd be hanging out with the movie stars, but we'd all just be sitting there waiting for the director to do a next setup, and it's distinctly unglamorous. I've got to be honest
Yeah.
with you.
Yeah, that's what my friends say too. Okay, so when you watch all of these movies, what do you feel like was your greatest lesson? Like you had to be having major light bulb moments and connecting dots in your own journey, especially if you did this really at the very beginning of your sobriety.
Mhm.
So, what were some of the things that really stood out to you through watching all of these movies?
Well, I think what movies do really well, and which is why movies are so successful as an art form, is that they show conflict, they show heroism, and they show emotion, and they convey emotion very powerfully. That's why people, when you think about it, paying all this money for parking and to go buy popcorn for $20 and movie tickets and everything to sit in the seat, you're trying to get something. And one of the most important things that you can get are these really emotionally poignant moments, and to move you to cry. That's what great drama, great story does for people. And I started to see that, like, I could read 20 or 30 books about addiction and recovery, and I did. I read all the books. I had the time. Look at my library; it's filled with quit lit. And yet, I was finding that the moments and the sort of like the messaging that I was getting from great films and the introspection I was getting from these great films was so much more powerful and poignant and direct than what I was getting from these books. And the fact that also, when you're reading a book, and again, this whole idea of subjectivity and objectivity, when you're reading the book, it's a very subjective experience within your own mind. When you start looking at other people outside yourself who are doing the things that you were doing when you were drinking, it's an objective representation of the person people perceived you to be, and the person that you probably were, or the person that you were destined to become if you had continued drinking. So those are very powerful subjective representations. I'm sorry, very objective representations of what is at stake, and the emotional toll that inflicts. And then you see other people's reactions to other people's problems with drugs and alcohol, and the incredible heroic efforts that people put into it, and the incredible fantastic endings, and these climaxes of, like, you made it, you're going to live, you made it through recovery, etc. And when you put all that stuff together, I realized that those kinds of tools in the conversation about addiction could really help people in a way that just merely talking or reading couldn't. And so I wanted to add, film appreciation, film analysis, and film and story to the conversation about addiction and recovery. And that's why I wrote the book, and that's the point that I really wanted to make in the book.
Yeah. What was your favorite movie out of everything you watched and why?
Oh, that's a great question. Um, there were so many great films, and I think every movie is different. Like, I talk about Lost Weekend because it's one of the oldest films about, and one of the first films about alcoholism as a disease. At the time, it was at the beginning of Alcoholics Anonymous, so it was very like a historically relevant film that won an Oscar, and it won the Palme d'Or. It was the first movie that ever won both awards. And Paramount almost didn't release it. They got offered $5 million from an alcohol company, and then Leaving Las Vegas almost wasn't made. But that's very powerful in a very different way, with a very different messaging, because it doesn't necessarily have a happy ending, but maybe that's there to teach us something profound about recovery. It's not always a guarantee. And then I think there's other movies that I thought were brilliantly executed for different reasons, like the family and friends issue, sons and daughters, mothers and sons, mothers and daughters, etc., in different films. But I think overall, in the conversation about mutual support and 12-step and meetings and recovering, I think Thanks for Sharing is a wonderful film. And I think it's the longest chapter in the book. It's at the end of the book, actually. And I think it's powerful because at the time it was sold and marketed as a movie about a bunch of sex addicts. And that's really what was but it was a false flag operation. It was sort of like a red herring. It was dangling a carrot. Be like, let's get a bunch of people to get interested in a movie about sex addiction. But once that's put aside after the first minute of the film, it's really a movie about people dealing with all addictions: alcohol, drugs, sex, what have you, and going to 12-step meetings and sharing their thoughts. And so it does a wonderful job of conveying what mutual support can do, how these people are, going day in, day out to these meetings, fighting the good fight, relapsing, coming back, fighting it out, dealing with friends and family, relapsing again, getting back on the wagon. It's heroic, and everybody has, and the story weaves into these great acting, like, Tim Robbins and Gwyneth Paltrow and Mark Ruffalo and Josh Gad and Pink. The singer Pink, she steals the movie with some of the stuff she says in the movie. I think it's just like the complete package, a movie that sort of encompasses a lot of issues. It touched me emotionally very much in the way that, like, how certain people, you expect your loved ones to forgive you now that you're sober, and that doesn't always happen on your timeline. That's talked about in the film. The fact that somebody who's in sobriety for a long period of time, like Tim Robbins, he thinks he knows what recovery is. You've got to go to the meetings. You've got to be in the rooms. And his son doesn't really want to go that route. And so it creates a clash. And so there's just a lot of dynamics in that movie. And it's sort of like a popcorn movie, but it's so much more than that. So I think it's the top of my must see list for movies about addiction recovery. For sure.
I love that. I will definitely be watching that now after hearing all of that. That's definitely on my list. You know what I loved about Leaving Las Vegas is I felt like it was the first time that I had seen something that really accurately depicted the internal pain of alcoholism, because it is, and as alcoholics, we get a bad rap, and rightfully so in a lot of ways, but it's so baffling for the people around us.
Mhm.
Like, people want to think and judge with a rational mind what you're doing in a compromised and irrational state of mind.
Uh-huh.
And it's so confusing in so many ways. And nobody understands. Like, they just see the actions we take, the mistakes we make, and the mess that we make. Everybody on the outside sees that, but nobody really gets to understand how badly we feel on the inside.
Yes.
That never really gets talked about. And that's what I felt like Leaving Las Vegas did beautifully. It
Yes.
really put an emotional picture to that internal pain. And I appreciated it. I mean, it was heartbreaking, but it's the truth. It is the truth.
The truth hurts, but it's very important to see it for what it is. And I think, and I tell the story in the book about Leila Kazez, who was the producer of the film, who's since passed away. She was like a remarkable person. And when she was at Lumiere Pictures getting this film getting financed, I remember we were at Universal, and we were talking about this, and one of the executives that I was having lunch with told a story about how Leila Kazez walked in. She'd given the script to one of these studios, and they said, "We love it. Nicolas Cage, not really sure about him, but we'll make it work." And Mike Figgis, really independent, kind of weird, funky hair. Okay, I guess with no budget and 16 millimeter camera, we could make it work. But the ending, really bummer. Can we just like turn that around and just make it really? He gets out of therapy and he goes on with his life and he moves out to the suburbs and becomes a professional. And Sarah ditches her job as a prostitute, and she ends up being a social worker, and they live happily ever after in the suburbs. And Lila Gazez just burst out laughing and just left the meeting, and then made the movie that should have been made and thankfully was made, which is much more important as a document, as a film. Because if they had ended the story like that, and in fact, also in the book I mentioned how one of the reasons that the original writer of the novel decided to commit suicide just as the movie had entered into production was his fear that the studio was going to gloss over and give it a happy ending. And that apparently was causing him so much anxiety, on top of the fact that he was really well advanced in his drinking problem. He actually committed suicide. So it's a very sad story, not just in the movie, but in real life as well. If audiences ever have the opportunity to see Nicolas Cage's acceptance speech at the Oscars that year, he does talk about the writer. It's a very moving tribute to, a very sad, lost talent.
Yeah. What is the most recent film that you watched that's in your book?
Oh, yeah, it's so funny. It's so funny. I just watched it, 4 Good Days. I just watched recently, and I thought that was terrific, and I wrote about it. And there's another movie with Sigourney Weaver, which is on my wish list as well, but I'll be watching that tonight. But 4 Good Days I thought was really powerful because it's sort of like a mother-daughter story, and it tells the story of boundaries with somebody who has a problem with drugs and alcohol. Here's a situation where Mila Kunis comes home after God knows how long out on the street using heroin, ruined life, been through rehab, and detox 16 times. Her mother's heard it all. And yet, there's your daughter who you raised, who you love unconditionally, the little baby that you held in your arm when she was young, and she's shivering on the front porch and she needs your help. What do you do? That's, I think, is very important to see because that is so millions of people go through that. They need to respect boundaries. They need to be healthy themselves in order to help others. And it brings up a lot of the issues that family and friends of people with addiction suffer, and how best to help them, how not to help them, how not to enable them. And so the rest of the movie is an examination of a lot of those themes and a lot of those conflicts seen in the film. And I think it's for anybody who has a friend or loved one who is dealing with an addiction and you're trying to help, or you want to make a difference in their life, or whatever that is, this is a very interesting film that I think has a lot to say about, how to get to that finish line and do it in a way that doesn't drive you crazy and ultimately helps in a positive way the person who you're trying to help.
Yeah, enabling is such a challenging thing, I think, especially as a parent, because it is a very thin line between enabling and just loving your child. That is,
Yes.
it's a thin line and it's confusing. And I know as an interventionist, it's one of the things that we have to talk about in so much detail when doing that process, right? Because you have to have some healthy boundaries, and
Yes.
you have to know where your line in the sand is, or you are enabling your person, and that does not serve them. It doesn't serve you, and it definitely doesn't serve them.
No. And I also bring that up in the movie, in the analysis of relationships based on alcohol. And one of the classics for that is Days of Wine and Roses. Then also more recently is When a Man Loves a Woman. And, where Andy Garcia really sort of tacitly approves of his wife's drinking problem. And he actually benefits from it because she's fun and lively and frisky and sexy and funny and all the things that it's sort of like the ultimate first date. You get to go out on a first date with your wife every night because she's so fun. It's not, so alcohol has made her into his fantasy of the perfect wife. Yet, when she realizes that she has a problem, she goes into rehab, that wife disappears. And now a new version of his wife comes out. And that's really where the story starts. It's more like a story of his recovery from her recovery. And that's a profound thing to put in a film that had never been put in a film before, is how somebody else's recovery can affect a loved one. And what is the basis of love? Are you in love with the person because they drink with you? Or are you in love with the person because they won't tell you not to drink? Or are you in love with the person because you really are truly in love with that person without alcohol? And that's a lot of those questions get asked indelicately or delicately after or during rehab. And sometimes, as you probably know, a lot of people who come out of rehab experience or through sobriety end up having to end relationships, not just friends, but with loved ones and partners, because they're just the foundations of their relationship have changed. And it's difficult to admit that alcohol is a part of any relationship or like
Mm-hmm.
the only part of a relationship. But in many respects, you need to say that.
And it often is, right? Because as a drinking person, I wasn't going to pick someone who didn't drink at the same level I did. Certainly once I was at more advanced stages, right? Where it was the primary consideration in my day to day life, right? I
Yeah.
would only be with people who were the same way.
Yeah.
That is actually When a Man Loves a Woman is one of my all-time favorite
Oh,
movies, certainly on this topic, for everything that you said, because it really does show a piece of the puzzle that doesn't get talked about. And certainly from a 12-step perspective, this for me in early sobriety, this was a regular part of the conversation
hmm.
that I would hear in meetings all the time. And I don't have a spouse, I've never had a spouse,
Uh-huh.
but people will talk about the dynamics changing with their spouse, not even in the ways that it changes your relationship. Certainly, if you got together as drinking people, you dated as drinking people, built your relationship as drinking people, and now one of you gets sober,
Right.
and all the fears that brings up for the other person. How's this going to affect our relationship? How's it going to affect our sex life? How's it going to
Yeah.
affect our
Yeah.
social life?
Right.
How are we going to connect with friends? What's this going to look like at holidays when our whole family drinks?
Oh,
Like,
yeah.
there's a lot of stuff that goes on for the partner.
Yeah.
But there's also this other piece of that where there can be some resentment and almost
Yeah.
some jealousy and envy of the time you spend with your recovering people.
Yes.
And for the
That's in the
addicted
movie.
person, it's like, this is the first time I've ever been accepted. This is the first time I've ever walked into a room and I felt like I fit in. This
Hmm.
is the first time I've ever been around a group of people that understand exactly how I am, who I am, how my brain works, have the same sick sense of humor as me, right? This is the first time that I've had all of that warm and fuzzy stuff in a group of people.
Sure.
But your person can get pretty sad by that because
Yeah.
they're also waiting to get you back. And when you're in early recovery, you're so dedicated
Mm.
to that recovery piece. Your person's sitting there going, okay, well, when is it time for me? Because
Yes.
when you were drinking, it was all about you.
Yes.
Right. And it was all about cleaning up the messes and lying for you and covering for you and taking care of the family when you couldn't and, supporting us and whatever the things were. And now you're sober and it's still all about you. Like, when does it shift back to
Yeah.
the us? And I think that movie just did a really beautiful job of showing this other side
Mhm.
of the sobriety thing that most people aren't talking about.
Yeah, and it was probably one of the more difficult, challenging chapters to write because alcohol was part of my existing relationship. I ended up getting a divorce, and we're still friends. We still see the kids all the time. I mean, it's not like a messy thing, but there was a lot of me. I think my wife. I'm not going to speak for her, but there's as I mentioned in the book. You have to there's a sort of like an atonement process, and the other person sort of expects you to be like, when are you going to fully apologize? When are you going to fully atone for this? When do you realize that what you did was wrong? And it's very difficult to, like, as much as you can say I'm sorry or I fucked up or I've stopped, I'm better now, everything's great, look, it's the new me, bright and shiny new, don't you see, don't you get it, I'm right here. But consolation doesn't work on another person's timeline. There's steps that you need to go through, and I think people that come out of recovery need to be, and I realized and I learned that I had to be more open to realizing that my ex-wife or other people that I may have harmed are not going to heal on my timeline. They're going to heal on their
That's
time.
right.
And yes, they are kind of owed something,
Yeah.
and that feeling is something that's very powerful.
Yeah. That's funny you say that too, because I can't tell you how many times I'm on the phone with a family about an intervention and they'll say, like, when do they get to the part where they make amends? I'm like, We don't even have your person sober yet. Like, we're nowhere near talking about amends, right? Like, let's just get the intervention done and get them healthy. We can worry about amends later.
That's
But
true.
that is for the people around us, that is so much on their mind, right? Because they're not facing all the stuff that we're facing. They're thinking, we're going to do XYZ and you're going to be fixed and we can go on with our lives, and it just definitely doesn't work that way.
Yeah, and that's why I think a lot of people fail in early recovery. One of the reasons is that everybody wants to check a box. We're a culture that wants quick fixes for everything. Is there a pill I can take? Is there, okay, go to 5 meetings, we're good. 90 meetings, 90 days, good. Check that box, fine. Rest of my life, got it. Everything's fine. But it doesn't work like that. It's more of a process, and I think if and part of that process with another person in your life is also a lot of work. You got to roll your sleeves up and go through, the shit, as it were.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, did you watch I can't think of the name of it right now, but Julia Roberts with her son
Ben
in
is
the
back.
movie? It is Ben is back. That's what I kept thinking, and I was
Yeah.
second guessing myself. Okay, I would love to hear your thoughts on that one.
Well, Ben is back is what Ben is back is not included in the book because I felt that I had already covered the mother, daughter, son, father. I wanted to keep it as like a father and son in Beautiful Boy, and a mother and daughter in 4 Good Days. And I felt that Ben and Back covered a lot of the things that I had mentioned in those two films. But I've decided I'm going to write a chapter about that for my follow-up book, which is Too Addicted in Film, More Addicted in Film, #2. But because there's plenty of other movies that I'd love to write about. But that's a very powerful film. And obviously, Julia Roberts does a wonderful performance. And, in many respects, I find that it's very much of a simple story. Like, the storyline is son comes back, he's a little bit unstable, relapses, buys drugs, owes money. She has to figure out the problem, solve it, gets him into rehab, and we're good to go. And it has sort of like, well, we hope that he comes out of it, all right. But I think the dynamic between Julia Roberts and the emotional toll that it's taken on her and the bravery that she shows, the courage and the resilience to just keep sticking by her son, to just not look the other way, not let him go back out on the street and die with a fentanyl overdose like everybody else is. Just that courage to do that, all the while doubting what you're doing, conveyed so wonderfully because she's such a great actress. That I think
Yeah.
is why it's such a powerful film.
Yeah, I thought it was a good one too. I just appreciate it when they're more realistic about the journey and what it really looks like for a lot of people,
Yeah.
because there isn't always a happy ending, right? And it is almost never from point A to point B. It's a rocky ride for a lot of people. So I feel like they could. I appreciate when that is portrayed in a more truthful manner. And it was one of the things, not a film, but Nurse Jackie. That was one of the things I loved about Nurse Jackie, because I feel like they really, gosh, they did it so well in her consistently relapsing. And every time, like, you had hope, you were like, this is going to be it.
Yeah.
And, but yeah, I think they did a great job on that. Well, Ted, I have loved this conversation, and I so appreciate what you did, and having a book that just comes from such a different place, that isn't the tragic story of addiction, and really showing that this can be a beautiful life. A sober life can be a beautiful life, and we have so many lessons to learn, but
Mhm.
we really get to, in sobriety, we get to kind of drive the ship, where when I was drunk, I definitely was not driving the ship.
Well, that's one of the things that I think motivated the book, and what I write about in the book, and sort of like how I end the book is that your life is really like an evolving story, and it has heroes and villains, and the villain of your story is your addiction, and you have to fight against Darth Vader, and he's your addiction. And eventually, if you believe in yourself and you do the work, you'll win and you'll save the galaxy. But ultimately, really, what you're doing is you're writing your own story. You're in control of the story. You're the screenwriter director of your own life, and you have complete creative control. And that's really what I think a lot of people can learn in sobriety, is that, like, everything is possible in sobriety. You can write any script you want, and your locus of control is now external, and you can do things as opposed to being so constrained by a story and imprisoned by a dead-end story, which is addiction. It's a story which usually always ends the same way, and it has an unhappy ending. So, we go to movies because we want happy endings, right? So write your own movie.
Yeah, that's excellent. The name of the book is Addicted in Film: Movies We Love About the Habits We Hate. I will link that in the show notes for everybody out there that wants to grab that. You can get that right from your podcast app. Once again, it's Addicted in Film: Movies We Love About the Habits We Hate. Ted, thank you so much again for coming on and sharing this conversation with me. It's been fantastic.
Oh, Angela, it's been my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. How delightful. It's been great.
You've reached the end of another great episode of the Addiction Unlimited podcast. Candid and honest conversation about addiction and recovery. Be sure to visit us at addictionunlimited.com to join the conversation and access show notes and links to everything we talked about. Love this episode? Please take 30 seconds to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes to help us improve and give you the information you want. Thanks for listening. See you next week.